The conference room felt smaller than I remembered. Brenna sat across from me, her fingers drumming against her notepad exactly the way they did 7 years ago, when she delivered the words that supposedly shattered my world. Next to her, Gordon adjusted his tie, still that nervous habit when delivering bad news, and there was Lillian from HR, wearing the same sympathetic expression she probably practiced in mirrors. "We've decided to let you go, Maya," Brenna said, her rehearsed tone betraying nothing. "Your recent performance hasn't met our standards, and we feel this is the best decision for both parties." I let my shoulders slump forward. I widened my eyes just enough to look shocked, but not overdramatic. I I don't understand. Can you give me another chance? I've been trying so hard." The beautiful thing about that moment was knowing they had no idea they were dancing to my choreography. Every late arrival, every half-hearted report, every meeting where I zoned out, I had orchestrated it all. They thought they were making a tough leadership decision. I was getting exactly what I desperately wanted, but was too terrified to ask for. Before I dive deeper into what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because I want to know where my story is reaching around the world. And please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell, because this gets so much crazier than you think. My name is Maya, and what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about power, control, and who's really pulling the strings in your workplace. 7 years ago, I was drowning. Fresh out of college, my parents had invested everything in my education. My younger brother needed money for his own studies. My grandmother's medical bills were piling up. When this major financial services company offered me a position in their data analysis department, I grabbed it like a lifeline. But within months, I knew I'd made a horrible mistake. The work crushed my creativity. Numbers, spreadsheets, reports that nobody read. I spent 8 hours daily in a gray cubicle, analyzing market trends for investment advisors who treated me like a printer that occasionally needed paper refills. My supervisor Kevin barely acknowledged my existence, except to pile more mindless tasks on my workstation. Every morning felt like suffocation. I'd sit in my car before walking into that building, fighting the urge to drive away and never return. But I couldn't quit. The guilt would have destroyed me. My family was counting on my income. In their eyes, I had the perfect job, stable, well-paying, respectable. So I started planning my escape. It began small. I'd arrive 5 minutes late, then 10, then 15. When Kevin mentioned my tardiness, I'd apologize profusely and promise to do better. Then, I'd be late again the next week. I started submitting reports one day past deadline. Not consistently, just often enough to create a pattern. When questioned, I'd claim computer problems or overwhelming workload, always with an excuse that sounded reasonable but left them slightly unsatisfied. During team meetings, I'd contribute just enough to avoid standing out, but my suggestions lacked the enthusiasm they'd seen in my first few months. I'd nod thoughtfully at others' ideas while offering nothing innovative myself. The genius was in the gradual decline. If I'd suddenly become terrible overnight, they might have offered training or support. Instead, I created the impression of someone slowly losing interest and capability, the kind of employee who drains team morale and needs to be quietly removed. Brenna started scheduling monthly check-ins. "Is everything okay, Maya? You seem less engaged lately." "I'm fine," I'd say, mustering just enough defensiveness to make her believe I was struggling, but too proud to admit it. Maybe I'm just adjusting to the workload. These conversations were masterpieces of manipulation. I'd reveal tiny vulnerabilities, mentions of feeling overwhelmed, hints that maybe this role wasn't what I expected, while rejecting any offered help. I was painting myself as someone who was failing, despite their best efforts to save me. The performance review cycle became my masterpiece. 6 months of carefully documented mediocrity had given them everything they needed. Brenna presented my evaluation like she was delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Your punctuality has become concerning. Your report quality has declined significantly. Team members have mentioned that you seem disengaged during collaborative projects." I nodded sadly, playing the role of someone finally confronting their inadequacy. Inside, I was celebrating. Every criticism was exactly what I'd worked to achieve. "We want to give you a formal improvement plan," Gordon added. 90 days to demonstrate significant progress in all these areas. This was the moment I'd been building toward. I needed them to fire me, not put me on an improvement plan that might actually succeed. So I did something that still makes me proud of my strategic thinking. "I appreciate the opportunity," I said, "but I think we both know this isn't working. Maybe it would be better for everyone if I started looking elsewhere." The psychology was perfect. By suggesting departure myself, I made them feel like firing me was the merciful choice. They weren't destroying my career, they were agreeing with my own assessment. It shifted their entire emotional framework from guilt to relief. Within 2 weeks, I was sitting in that conference room, receiving my termination notice. The severance package gave me 3 months to figure out my next move, but I'd already been planning for months. During my lunch breaks, I'd been researching graphic design programs. On weekends, I'd been building a portfolio. Every evening, after my soul-crushing data analysis, I'd been teaching myself the skills I actually wanted to use. The day after they fired me, I enrolled in an intensive design program. 6 months later, I was freelancing. Within 2 years, I'd built a client base. By year 4, I was running a small agency. Year 6 brought a partnership with a major marketing firm. And then, 6 months ago, something incredible happened. Brenna reached out through LinkedIn. The company was restructuring their marketing department and needed a creative director to oversee digital strategy. Someone had recommended me. The irony was delicious. They were so impressed with my portfolio and agency reputation that they had no idea who I really was. Brenna scheduled a phone interview, gushing about my impressive background and exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. During our call, I waited for recognition. Nothing. 7 years, a different hairstyle, and a completely different industry had made me invisible to her. She was hiring the creative professional I'd become, with no memory of the failing analyst she'd once fired. I almost declined the offer. My agency was thriving. I didn't need their validation or their paycheck. But as I thought about it, I realized this was something much more valuable than money. This was the chance to reveal a truth that would haunt them forever. I accepted the position and started planning the most sophisticated psychological revelation of my life. My first month back was beautifully surreal. I walked through the same hallways where I'd once felt trapped, but now I carried myself with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Kevin, my old supervisor, nodded politely when we passed, clearly trying to place where he knew me from. I attended meetings with the same executives who had once dismissed my potential. They hung on every word of my strategic presentations, taking notes on insights from someone they'd once considered a liability. Brenna introduced me to the team with glowing praise. "Maya brings exceptional creative vision and proven leadership experience. I'm excited to see how she transforms our department." The beautiful irony was watching her praise qualities she'd once criticized. My innovative thinking had been lack of focus. My strategic vision had been poor attention to detail. Same person, different context, completely different perception. But I wasn't there for ego satisfaction. I was there to teach them something that would fundamentally change how they viewed their own judgment. I scheduled an all-hands department meeting for my 3rd month, exactly 7 years and 1 week after my termination date. The timing wasn't coincidental. I want to share some thoughts about leadership, decision-making, and the stories we tell ourselves about success and failure, I announced when sending the meeting invitation. As I prepared my presentation, I thought about the lives impacted by their snap judgments. How many other employees had they dismissed without understanding the full story? How many careers had they shaped through assumptions rather than insight? The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully, professional but approachable, confident but not intimidating. I wanted them focused on my words, not distracted by power plays. 23 people filed into the conference room. Brenna sat in her usual spot, Gordon beside her. Kevin found a chair near the back. Lillian from HR positioned herself by the wall, notepad ready. "Thank you all for being here," I began. "Before we discuss future strategy, I want to tell you about a decision this department made 7 years ago that perfectly illustrates everything wrong with how we evaluate people." The room was attentive but relaxed. They assumed this was going to be a generic leadership anecdote, maybe something from my previous company. 7 years and 1 week ago, this department terminated a young analyst for performance issues, poor punctuality, declining work quality, apparent disengagement from team projects. I watched Brenna's expression shift slightly. Something was nagging at her, but she couldn't quite place it. The termination seemed justified. The employee had shown a clear pattern of declining performance over several months. Management did everything right, documented the issues, offered improvement plans, made the difficult but necessary decision. Gordon was nodding along, probably remembering similar tough calls he'd made. But what if I told you that every single performance issue was deliberately orchestrated? What if that employee was never failing at all, but was instead executing the most sophisticated exit strategy you've ever seen? The room went completely silent. Brenna's face had gone pale. Recognition was dawning in her eyes. What if that young analyst was too terrified to quit a job that was destroying her soul, so she carefully manipulated you into firing her instead? What if every late arrival, every missed deadline, every sign of disengagement was calculated to achieve exactly the outcome you thought you were imposing? I let that settle for a moment before delivering the revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about their own authority. "My name is Maya Chen. 7 years ago, you fired me from the data analysis department for performance issues that I spent months engineering. Today, I'm standing here as your new creative director because that firing gave me the freedom to discover who I actually was." The silence in that room was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just shock. It was the sound of people realizing that everything they believed about a pivotal moment in their careers was completely wrong. Brenna's mouth was slightly open. Gordon looked like he was doing calculations in his head. Kevin's face had gone through several colors. "You never had the power you thought you had in that termination meeting," I continued. "You were puppets in a performance I directed, choreographed, and executed flawlessly. While you believed you were making tough leadership decisions, I was controlling every aspect of the narrative. But the real bomb was still coming. The revelation that would ensure they never looked at employee management the same way again. Here's what's going to haunt you," I said, watching their faces carefully. "How many other times has this happened? How many employees have you terminated thinking you were making decisive leadership calls when you were actually being manipulated by someone who wanted out but couldn't find another way?" I pulled out a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. Inside were printouts of exit interview data I'd requested from HR under the guise of understanding department turnover patterns. In the 7 years since you fired me, this department has terminated 43 people for performance issues. 43 individuals whose careers you thought you were managing, whose futures you believed you were determining. I started walking around the table, making eye contact with each person. But what if you weren't the decision makers at all? What if some of those people were just like me, trapped in roles that were slowly destroying them, too afraid or financially constrained to quit, so they found subtler ways to orchestrate their own escape? The psychological impact was devastating. I watched Gordon's confidence crumble as he mentally reviewed every termination he'd overseen. Brenna was staring at her hands, probably thinking about all the times she'd felt proud of making tough but fair personnel decisions. The beautiful irony is that you hired me back because of everything I accomplished after you set me free. My creative agency, my industry reputation, my strategic thinking, all of it exists because you gave me exactly what I needed 7 years ago. You've been celebrating the indirect results of your own manipulation. Kevin raised his hand tentatively. "But if you wanted to leave, why didn't you just quit?" The question revealed everything wrong with their understanding of workplace power dynamics. Because quitting would have meant disappointing my family, losing my severance, and carrying the shame of giving up on a good job. Being fired meant I was a victim of circumstances beyond my control. It gave me a story that preserved my dignity while achieving my goal. I returned to the front of the room and faced them directly. You spent months documenting my declining performance, having serious conversations about my future, weighing the difficult decision to let me go. You invested emotional energy in managing what you thought was a failing employee. But I was never failing. I was succeeding at something completely different. The weight of realization was settling over the room like fog. These were intelligent people who prided themselves on reading situations and making sound judgments. Learning they'd been completely blind to what was actually happening was shattering their professional self-confidence. Every performance review where you expressed concern about my trajectory, every meeting where you discussed strategies to improve my engagement, every moment you spent believing you understood what was happening. You were living in a reality I constructed for you. Lillian from HR looked physically ill. Her job was literally to understand employee behavior and motivations. Discovering she'd been completely deceived by someone she'd pitied was destroying her faith in her own expertise. But here's the part that should really terrify you, I continued, savoring this moment I'd been planning for months. I wasn't some mastermind with years of manipulation experience. I was a 22-year-old kid who figured this out in desperation. If I could orchestrate something this sophisticated while barely understanding workplace politics myself, imagine what truly experienced people could accomplish. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning cycling on. Think about Marcus from accounting, who you let go 3 years ago for chronic absenteeism. Think about Jennifer in client services, who seemed to lose all initiative before you terminated her in 2019. Think about David in operations, whose work quality inexplicably declined until you had no choice but to end his employment. I was naming real people whose terminations I'd researched. With each name, I watched recognition flicker across different faces. These weren't random examples. These were specific cases they remembered making difficult decisions about. What if Marcus was orchestrating his absences because his wife's illness made him need flexible schedule options he was too proud to request? What if Jennifer had already secured a position elsewhere but needed to be terminated to avoid a non-compete clause she couldn't afford to violate? What if David was planning to launch his own consulting firm but needed severance money to bridge the financial gap? The paranoia I was planting was beautiful in its logic. Every employee termination they'd ever overseen was now suspect. Every performance issue they'd documented might have been theater. Every difficult personnel decision they'd agonized over might have been someone else's carefully planned outcome. Gordon cleared his throat. Are you saying that's what actually happened with those people? I'm saying you have no way of knowing, I replied. Just like you had no way of knowing with me. You believed you were seeing authentic performance decline when you were actually watching calculated manipulation. How would you recognize the difference? That was the poisonous seed I'd come here to plant. Not just the revelation that they'd been wrong about me, but the permanent doubt about their ability to accurately assess any employee's situation. Brenna finally found her voice. Why are you telling us this? What do you want from us? It was the question I'd been waiting for. I want you to understand that power isn't what you think it is. You believed you held my career in your hands 7 years ago. You thought you were making a decision that would devastate me, but I was the one controlling the entire situation. I wrote the script, directed the scenes, and got exactly the ending I wanted. I moved closer to her, speaking directly, but not aggressively. You've spent 7 years believing you made a tough but necessary business decision. You probably used my termination as an example when training other managers about difficult conversations. You might have even felt proud of how professionally you handled a challenging situation. Her expression confirmed I was right. But none of that was real. The competent manager you thought you were being, the decisive leadership you thought you were demonstrating, the difficult judgment call you thought you were making. It was all illusion. You were just following my choreography. The psychological devastation was complete. I had taken their professional confidence and revealed it as elaborate self-deception. The reason I'm telling you this isn't revenge in any traditional sense. I'm not here to hurt you or damage your careers. I'm here to give you a gift. The gift of humility about how little you actually understand about the people you manage. I opened my presentation software and advanced to a slide I'd prepared. Moving forward, our department is going to operate differently. We're going to assume that every employee interaction contains layers we might not see. We're going to question our assumptions about motivation and performance. We're going to consider that the stories people present to us might not be the complete truth. The slide showed a new framework for employee evaluation that emphasized curiosity over judgment, conversation over documentation, and collaborative problem solving over unilateral decision making. This isn't about being paranoid or distrustful. It's about recognizing that people are complex, that workplace relationships involve multiple agendas, and that true leadership requires understanding the reality behind the performance. I clicked to the next slide, which outlines specific changes to our management approach. We're going to start having different conversations with struggling employees. Instead of documenting decline, we're going to explore what might be driving behavioral changes. Instead of assuming incompetence, we're going to consider whether someone might be communicating needs in ways we're not recognizing. Kevin raised his hand again. Are you saying we should never terminate anyone? I'm saying we should understand why termination is happening and who's really driving that decision. If someone genuinely can't perform their role, that's a legitimate business choice. But if someone is orchestrating their own exit because they're afraid to have honest conversations about their actual needs, that's a failure of communication and leadership. The final slide contained what would become our new department mission statement. We're going to create an environment where people feel safe being authentic about their career goals, struggles, and their needs. We're going to make manipulation unnecessary by making honest conversation possible. I closed the laptop and faced them one final time. 7 years ago, I was too scared to tell you that this job was destroying my creativity and that I desperately wanted to pursue design. I was too worried about disappointing people to admit that I needed something different. So I manipulated you into making the decision I couldn't make myself. The room was still processing everything, but I could see understanding beginning to replace shock. That was a failure on both sides. I failed to communicate authentically, and you failed to create conditions where authentic communication felt safe. My manipulation succeeded because your leadership approach made manipulation seem like the best available option. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave them with their thoughts. I'm genuinely excited to work with you all in my new role, but I wanted this foundation of honesty before we move forward. I wanted you to understand that leadership isn't about having power over people. It's about creating conditions where people don't need to deceive you to get what they need. As I walked toward the conference room entrance, Brenna called my name. Maya, wait. I turned back to face her. I'm sorry, she said simply. Not for firing you because you're right. That's what you wanted. But for not creating a workplace where you felt safe telling us what you actually needed. That apology meant more than any revenge I could have orchestrated. It showed she understood the real lesson. Thank you, I replied. That's exactly the kind of leadership this department needs moving forward. I left them in that conference room to process what had happened. Over the following weeks, the changes were remarkable. People started having different kinds of conversations. Managers began asking different questions when performance issues arose. The entire culture shifted toward curiosity and collaboration. 3 months later, Gordon approached me about an employee who seemed to be declining in engagement. Instead of documenting problems, he wanted to explore what might be driving the changes. Together, we discovered that the employee was struggling with childcare issues, but afraid to request flexible scheduling because previous requests had been denied. We solved the problem through conversation instead of creating a termination case study. Brenna started hosting monthly forums where employees could anonymously share feedback about workplace challenges. The insights revealed dozens of small issues that had been festering into larger problems because people didn't feel safe addressing them directly. Kevin completely restructured his team meetings to include regular check ins about job satisfaction and career development, not just project updates. The transformation wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was real. We started attracting better talent because word spread that our department handled employee concerns differently. Retention improved because people felt heard and supported. 6 months after my revelation, the department received recognition for innovative management practices. The irony was beautiful. They were being celebrated for lessons learned from being completely outsmarted by someone they'd underestimated. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't professional recognition. It was watching these intelligent, well-meaning people grow into better leaders because they'd learned to question their own assumptions. My revenge wasn't destruction or humiliation. It was transformation. I turned their moment of perceived authority into a catalyst for genuine growth. Looking back, I realized that my elaborate manipulation 7 years earlier wasn't just about escaping a job I hated. It was about taking control of my narrative when I felt powerless to change my circumstances directly. The real victory wasn't proving them wrong about my abilities. It was teaching them that true leadership requires understanding the complex motivations behind human behavior. Every day in this role, I'm reminded that people are more complicated than they appear, that workplace dynamics involve multiple layers of truth, and that the best managers are the ones humble enough to admit they don't have all the answers. If you've made it this far in my story, I want you to know that this experience changed how I think about every relationship in my life. Whether it's workplace dynamics, family expectations, or friendships, I've learned to look for the stories people can't tell directly and create space for those hidden truths to emerge safely. Please let me know in the comments if you've ever been in a situation where you felt like you had to manipulate circumstances to get what you needed. I promise I'll read every single response because these stories matter, and your experiences could help someone else feel less alone in their struggles. And if this story made you think differently about power, leadership, or workplace relationships, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I share more stories about navigating complex human dynamics and finding your authentic path, even when it requires taking unconventional routes to get there. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is reveal the truth that changes everything.